Okay, so it's 6 o'clock. Hello and welcome everyone. I am Rodrigo Poche, and I'm your host for this LSE-Miguel Dols Fellows meeting, in which you're going to be presenting the wares of what you have been doing well at the LSE during this term. So, and after that, we'll all gather up for dinner. Thank you, nice place. That Matthias has put for us. So thank you to Matthias for organizing everything and putting everything together. We have quite a lot of fellows today, so 8 presentations. And of those 8 presentations, we need to finish by 8 o'clock. So it's a strict 15 minutes presentation each, which means 10 minutes presentation plus 5 minutes for questions and some feedback. From me, if I become a bit harsh on the feedback, don't be afraid. That's the norm here at the LSE. So without further ado, what I'm going to call is on Cesar Conte to come forward. And so you're the first one, who is a PhD candidate at the University of California. And he's going to look into British participation in international radical conservatism between your continent and neoliberalism. So, yeah, 10 minutes, and I will be followed by questions. I didn't bring a pointer today. No, sorry. I have one.
You tell me.
Yes. So is this one not? It's not another one. Yeah. I also. There's one over here, but you can usually don't have that. It's right over here, so you don't need to have. This is the microphone.
Well, otherwise, you can just go through the classic keyboard.
Okay, should work now.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Marco.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Canada Advanced Center for giving us this opportunity to stay academic stay here at the LSE for organizing this event. Well, my presentation is aligned to my PhD thesis about the shared debate among radical conservatism in Europe and the US during the Cold War. Well, the presentation is a structure in 4 sections, a little bit about my methodology, then what is radical conservatism, my results and discussions, and the conclusions. Well, the object of my research can be defined as an intellectual history. So my methodology follows historical contextualism, which was developed by the Cambridge School, led by Popov and Skinner. This methodology understanding textual objects as manifestation of a dialogue act. That means that is focused on situate the text within a broader atmosphere, the author's life, and the influence on the text. This perspective is vital for my research because I adopted a transnational perspective focused on certain concerns such as anti-communism, Christian identity across Europe, because my object is radical conservatism, a political culture, a very, very heterogeneous political culture. Well, what is a political culture? It's a normative framework in which ideas, rituals, and language acquire coherent meanings and enable a shared interpretation of reality. Well, nowadays we're facing a growing body of literature about radical parties in Europe and in the West. So we have a proliferation of concepts, but a lack of a shared terminology. It's the same with radical conservatism. We don't have a unique definition, but a lot of different authors emphasizing different features. So as some kind of ideal type, we can say that it's a very, very heterogeneous political culture which serves the following features: defense of inequality, confidence in superpersonal forces, and attachment to romantic irrationalism and traditional hierarchical values. Well, my objective during this period of the LSE is to prove that there is a monomorphism. That means that different manifestations of this radical conservatism are compatible with a sole definition of political culture. That means that the British and American New Right should be included in a wider definition with Catholic, conservative, radical Catholicism. The other objective is to prove that Francoism should also be understood as an integral part of this wider transnational configuration. So these objectives came from an analytical background with the stand that since 1945, there was been a dual crisis inside radical conservatism. It faces an intellectual crisis and a political marginalization across the West. So they needed to focus on transnational concerns such as anti-communism, the European Christian identity, and the American, because it was a debate that it was the Abendland, the West, Europe, which was the geographical unit of this political culture, and a promotion of an alternative conception of democracy. Recent research, for example, Federico de Nueve or Martin Conway have proved that democracy was a far more contested concept that we have thought during the early Cold War. So it was a moment where things were defining. And radical conservatism was trying to improve its position. Well, this section is divided in two different ideas. First, there is some ideas shared by the whole West. For example, the notion of silent majority, which was a revolutionary concept during the late 60s and 70s. And the second part are the personal encounter and some case studies to support my argument. Well, silent majority was a concept coined by Richard Nixon. It designated a white middle-class demographic driven by a fear of falling. That means anxiety caused by a perceived decrease in social status. Within this framework, three main ideas emerged: the inevitability of neoliberalism, the need for a stronger authority, and that the society was too permissive, and they need some curve for these elements. Well, the propagation of neoliberal ideas resulted from a constellation of transnational think tanks, such as the Montpellier Society, the Center for Policy Studies. World crisis wasn't the cause, but with a widespread perception of social crisis, created the opportunity for these ideas to emerge and to pave the way for a new conception of rights and duties, aligned with a more liberalistic society. In the UK, for example, the loss of empire forced Britain to redefine its national identity, and some opted for the concept of Little England. Among them, Enoch Powell became one of the most influential precursors of Thatcherism for the broad public. His 1968 Rivers of Blood speech reflected wider anxieties about immigration, social order, and national coherency. They are the same concerns as for George Wallace in America or Alain de Benoit in France, in the foundation in 1968 of the Brest think tank. Also, there is a concept new for the new one, which is it has been an actualization of the new political history, which is the sexual citizenship. That is to highlight the importance of morality and gender for this radical culture. The defense of hierarchy extended beyond politics and economy to the family, promoting an ideal citizen who was economically independent, is heterosexual, either Christian, male. So after this, the key question arises. The new right is new, right? Well, the short answer is no, and the long one is no, but. Firstly, there is a problem with the label new right, because it imposes an artificial coherence which obscures the internal fractionalism and implicitly denies its deep intellectual roots. Alternatively, its conceptualization within radical conservatism capture the long-term intellectual continuities and the diverse yet interconnected evolving principles. With the case of studies that I'm working right now, I would like to highlight, for example, Angus Mott, which was a very relevant character in the story of the British New Right, because he's recognized by his critical position against the Keynesian consensus, but he also established humanistic limits to the economic freedom. He was closely aligned to the Monday Club, who was very conservative, but self-proclaimed representative of the radical right for a parliamentary conservative group aiming to regulate and to oppose decolonization. And he and Angus Mott also participated in meetings of the European Center for Documentation and Information, a transnational forum for radical conservatism. Well, the Monday Club, which is one of the main think tanks of this British New Right, has our own magazine which publishes, for example, reflections on Mahat's view of society, articles by Thomas Molnar, a regular contributor to the American Radical Catholic magazine Triumph, which was inspired by the Spanish national Catholicism. It also, the Monday Club also advocates for a punitivist society and to a more individualistic economy.
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes left? Okay. Well, I would like also to highlight that an exploration of the British presence in transnational radical conservative networks such as SELI reveals how they presented and introduced new approaches while reminded within the same interpretative law. For example, in 1966, the first year of Sir John Rogers, a British MP who presides the international organization, the annual conference shows the European help to Africa as the annual topic. That is linked to the Tories' concern about the situation in Rhodesia. In 1963, he introduced an early speech about positive anti-communism. That is different to the Catholic one because it was focused on the economic and material side of the struggle instead of just denying the communism as a form of atheism. In 1960, Angus Mott also participated in this transnational forum with a discourse in which he aimed to reconcile to reunite individualism with spiritualism as a cure for the alienating system of the industrial age. Finally, I also would like to address that there are some organizations such as Friends of the National Spain that evidence how National Catholic Spain was perceived as a real utopia, and they think and thought that Francoism was just another way of being European because it represents another way of an authoritarian state with Christian gods and able to face liberal modernity. So for monomorphism, I think there are more, we need a further research to prove this hypothesis, but we have more elements in common than those which can be defined as two different traditions. And for the end of the Francoist exceptionalism, we have plenty of personal encounters, letters, and interactions that prove that Francoism wasn't so isolated. Well, that's my conclusions. That's it.
Okay. Questions, Professor? One?
Anyways,
No, you might as well stay there. There's no need to rush and listen. You have to face the music. That's the norm here. So questions one, questions two, questions three. So, all right, so then is my question. I'm still struggling to know what you're trying to present. What is it that you're trying to present? What is the main question driving your research?
that we need a new conception of radical conservatism, which included the British and the American new right into the continental narrative, a narrative which also
Listen, I didn't ask you what you want to present. I ask you, what is your research question? And a question is a question. So what drives your research? What is your research question?
My question was, what is the British new right compatible with a Catholic tradition of radical conservatism?
Okay. Fine. Good. Have you thought about what is new in the new right?
What, sorry?
What is new in the new right? Because that's, I think you're trying to link, I mean, Britain, after all, is not a Catholic country.
Yeah, but they share a same logic. They perceive the same threats.
Okay.
So the Catholic component in the continent is important, but during the Cold War there is an evolving movement. They changed, especially with the Second Vatican Council, they changed the vision about liberalism and about the collaboration with Protestant countries and Protestant movements. So during this period, they are converging into more similar logic. But the threats, the way of the rationality they have in their defense of a more authoritarian state, they are very similar since they are facing the threats perceived as the real enemies.
Okay, so yes, one thing you have to realize is that you're talking to a broader audience. You're not talking to an audience of historians. And the good thing about research and being in a center which is multidisciplinary is that you have to bring everyone together.
Yeah.
And what would make this interesting is first to try to articulate into a question like, because this comparative, what makes, let's say, radical rights that come from very different traditions converge towards certain areas or topics or whatever. And that would be, I think, something that would engage more people beyond. Second thing, you have a lot of things going on in your slides. You have to cut the content of your slides by 90%, which I think is the universal way. So if you put far too much there, people are not paying attention to what you're saying. They're trying to read, and that's it. And you tend to use too much jargon. I know that this is what historians do, but it's not very good for communicating. My advice would be try to cut the jargon and then define. You put it everything about this idea of monomorphism, but it's not that you have to define it in your presentation. And you haven't told us why this concept is important. So this is what you have to have your messages clear from the very beginning, especially when you have 10 minutes. And not just when you have 10 minutes. If you have an hour and your message is not clear from the beginning, people are going to get dispersed. And then final thing, the reading. When you read, you want to say what you want to say. Try to do the things that you're saying, what is it that I want to say? What is my message? Get your slides rid of words, put images with a few words that would highlight, and you know your topic better than anyone else. here and in most other places. So just try, there's no need to rely on a paper, because when you're reading, you're not engaging with the audience and you're not conveying the message in an adequate way.
I know that's for the English. In Spanish, I don't read, but it's true that
Is
foreign
it-
language, it's very difficult to me. And to condensate so much information.
Don't look for excuses. Your
No.
English is okay. So you're holding the chair now. That means that you're nervous.
I'm nervous. I was the first person to speak.
You're behind the table, you're holding the chair, so you're looking for excuses. Your English is more than good enough. And so it does get worse when you have to read and remember everything. So just come here, grab the limelight, saying, I'm Fessa, and I'm going to talk to you. And this is my message. So I'm going to talk about traditions of extreme right that in principle look very different, but they have converged into certain topics because of whatever reasons. And that's the way. So if you're flushing everything, looking down, you're showing that you're nervous. And in this profession, when you look nervous, you'll pray for those that want to feed on the weak. So you have an interesting topic. My advice would be just let it flow. And I know that in some disciplines there's too much to read, but the more I see, in my experience, when you go to conferences where everyone reads, then everyone switches off. And they read very often because they cannot remember what they are talking about. The idea is you have to have a clear message and it has to be done quickly. All right, so thank you very much. On is, if I brought the, yes. So here it is Vladimir Serva. I think we are almost in alphabetical order, with the exception of Vasilis, who comes next. Who is a PhD candidate at the University of Oviedo in Spain, at the Catholic University of the North of Chile in Antofagasta. And you're going to be talking about immigration, occupational downgrading, and native labor market outcomes in Europe. The floor is yours, 10 minutes.
So, sorry. Thank you for the introduction. Today I will present not just one paper, but a research topic that covers two different papers about the occupational downgrading for immigrant workers in Europe. So, the international immigrations is a very important topic, especially in the European Union. First, because the size of the immigrant inflows in recent years, and also because the immigration now is the second most important concern among European citizens. So the relevant question here that I will try to answer is, can European labor markets efficiently absorb large immigration inflows? If the answer is no, immigrants are mislocated across occupations, and these distortions can generate adverse effects for the native workers. So based on the theory, the impact of the immigrations depend on the degree of competitions between native and immigrant workers, which depend on if they are working in the same jobs or same occupations. So the competitive pressure will be smaller if they are different in the occupational distributions between native and immigrant workers. So what is the problem here? If the low competitions come from the difference in the occupational distributions that reflects a skill difference between native and immigrant workers, this is not a problem. But this argument doesn't hold when we don't find any systematic difference in terms of education level between native and immigrant workers. So the problem is when these low competitions is a result of these mislocations of immigrant workers across occupations. What is mislocation? It's very common to find a highly educated immigrants working in a job that require a lower skill level. For example, a Chilean economist cleaning restaurant in UK. This is a very good example of this occupational downgrading. And this downgrading can be explained because the immigrants face language barrier and problems with the credential recognition and also discrimination, for example. So the occupational downgrading is a problem for immigrant workers, but does it matter for native workers? So the occupational downgrading matter for native workers because distort the labor market competitions, push the competitions down into low-skilled jobs. So where the low-skilled native workers now face a much stronger competition. So I'm gonna try to explain this idea using these two papers. The first paper, now under review, I show that the occupational downgrading occurs in the case of European labor market, and in the paper two, in progress right now, I focus in the last step of this idea. What are the consequences of this occupational downgrading for the native workers? So, first paper, I use a panel of 13 European countries between 2010 and 2023. I use labor markets segmented by country, education, and experience cells. So, in the first part of this paper, I calculate the occupational distributions by resident status. The first column shows the distribution for native workers. The second and the third for European immigrants and non-European immigrants. So these two columns show the downgrading situation for immigrant workers, which can be explained by difference in terms of return to education, return to skills comparative to the native workers. So we can see a lower participation for immigrants in high skill occupations comparative to the native with the same education and the same experience level, and also higher participations in low skill jobs. So this is especially true in the case of non-European immigrants. So in the column 4 and 5, we can see the contrafactual distributions without this distortion, without the occupational downgrading. In this case, we assume that immigrants and natives have the same return to education, the same return to skills. So when I remove this difference, we can see an increase of the participation of immigrant workers in high skill occupations and a decrease of the participations in low skill occupations. So this difference in terms of occupational distributions are not explained by differences in terms of skills. What matters are the difference in terms of return to these skills. So, and how the labor market fails to assimilate and value these immigrant skills. So the occupational downgrading occurs in the case of European labor markets. Now, I'm gonna use the difference between these downgrading distributions and this contrafactual distribution to calculate a kind of occupational downgrading index to capture the intensity of this phenomenon in each labor market. And in the second part of the paper, I show that this downgrading is not as static situations increase when the labor market becomes saturated with a large immigrant influx. An increase in the immigrant share within each labor market increase the misallocations of immigrant workers across occupations. These effects are stronger in the case of non-European immigrants and in the case of immigrants women. Also, I find that these saturation effects are significantly attenuated in countries with more active labor market integration policies. So now, the problem is, the next question is, if this distortion, the occupational downgrading, affects the native workers. So if we remember, when the immigrants are downgrading, they concentrate in low-skilled jobs. So increase the competition for low-skilled native workers. So in this second paper, I'm gonna try to test if the immigration shocks generate any adverse effects for native workers, especially low-skilled native workers, and especially in regions with high downgrading index. So for this second paper, I use a panel of 32 European regions between 2010 and 2023. We classify these regions according to this downgrading index in the initial year of this period. And then I estimate this equation, where the dependent variable is the wage employment rate and unemployment rate for native workers. The independent key variable here is the immigration shock, and the immigration shock interacted by this binary indicator for high downgrading regions. We also include a vector of regional level control, region and year fixed effects, and also I address the concern about the endogeneity of the immigration shocks using the historical geographic distribution of migrants across regions like an instrument. So, in other words, I compare the effects of the migrations in high and low downgrading regions. This is the idea. This table shows the result. The first three columns for all native workers, the effects in all native workers, then low-skilled native workers, and finally, high-skilled native workers. So the first row of this table shows the impact of the migrations in regions with low downgrading index. We can see we don't find any effects and any outcomes in this type of regions. But the second row of this table shows the differential impact of the migrations in high downgrading regions. In this case, we can see a negative impact of the migrations in terms of employment, unemployment, wage. So the migrations only in high downgrading regions reduce the employment rates, increase the unemployment rates, and decrease the wage, especially for low-skilled native workers. So how I can explain this result? First, I construct a job quality index, and I show that in high downgrading regions, immigrants work in lower quality jobs and compete directly with low-skilled native workers. This is the main explanation for my result. Also, I have another explanations based in the structural condition of these regions. The high downgrading regions have a lower GDP per capita, persistent long-term employment, low technological intensity, and more specialization in primary sector. So these structural conditions constrain the capacity of this region to absorb efficiently the immigration influx. So the downgrading, this distortion in the labor market, especially for immigrant workers, is not uniform across the geography. It concentrates in structural weaker labor markets, which has a negative impact in the outcomes for immigrant workers and the result for native workers. So in conclusions, the key finding here is any adverse effects of immigrations for native workers, especially low-skilled native workers, doesn't depend of the size of on the size of the immigration inflows. Depend of the capacity of this region to absorb efficiently the immigrant skills. So in terms of policy implications and combining the result of both papers, any policy that support or try to improve the labor and economic integration for immigrant workers reduce the occupational downgrading, very good news for the immigrant workers, and also reduce any adverse effects for native workers. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Very much, Vladimir. So, questions to him? Anyone? Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
You showed in your regression that there is a statistically significant effect for low-income workers, not for high.
No.
I wonder, either as a robustness check or just to like dig deeper, if you could perhaps divide by industry within the low-skilled natives and whether there is different effects depending on the industry. It could paint like a deeper picture, or it could work as a robustness check if you actually get statistical significant results.
If the concentration of the immigrants across industry reflects this occupational downgrading, maybe we can find heterogeneous effects across industries. Yeah, it's very good idea.
I don't know much about this, so I'm just like proposing, but it could make sense. Yeah.
Maybe we can find more adverse effects in low-skilled native in service sector.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
You never. Yeah. Exactly.
I had a question regarding economic performances, because you chose research from 2010 to 2023, right? So between those years, we had two major economic setbacks, 2008 and then 2020. So the economic crisis and then the COVID crisis. Did you see any kind of relation between those economic setbacks and maybe any impact on the research?
Not for the moment, but I can see a decrease of the intensity of the immigrant inflows in the pandemic, for example. But any effects of these macroeconomic conditions are capturing maybe in the year of fixed effects in this regulation. So yeah, maybe can be easier to separate these estimations after and before, but yeah.
Okay, so if you were to propose to a decision maker at a European level or a national level, a policy recommendation based on the results of your research, what would that be?
So, based on my result, any policy that improves the integrations is a good news for the immigrants and also for the natives.
Yeah, there's not any policies. What type of policy? Where's the bottleneck that prevents migrants from actually developing their own skills or maximizing their potential?
Maybe policy that try to improve or increase the occupational mobility of immigrant workers when they arrive to the country. Maybe.
So, for example, a policy like the government policy here in the UK, that you're sponsored by a company for your visa, and that restricts mobility of migrants. Would that be a problem, or would that be beneficial for
Again, based on the literature and based on my result, any policy that try to restrict the occupational mobility is not a good policy for all the populations. So again, maybe a policy that try to improve the occupational mobility or integrations over the time for immigrants is.
that's what you have to start thinking about.
Yeah.
Because
I need to.
you're not doing research just for the curiosity of doing research, which is always interesting, but is how are you going to improve the life of migrants that come into any country and decide, so how are you going to improve the efficiency of the labor market, and what is it that you can propose to make that, in the end, that migrants can actually benefit themselves and benefit the society in which they live.
And also the native workers. This is the idea of this paper. The effects not only in the immigrants, also in the native workers.
Okay, two things here. First thing, most people, when they say you have 10 minutes, they panic and they do half a paper. You come and put two papers together. That's ambitious, but it's not clear what you were trying to defend. So you need, if you put two papers together, what is the common theme, and how does the results of each paper lead to the common theme? Another thing, all these tables are too technical. If you put a table like that to, let's say, someone who is lay or a decision maker, they might be very intelligent, but they will just switch off. So you want to bring in there, and yours like that too old-fashioned in this day and age. So my advice would be less words, more images, and zoom into your results. Because yes, you don't have all the controls here, which is sometimes it's nice in a paper, but nevertheless, what you want to is to highlight, and you have them in red, but not to put everything else in. This isn't the main result, and this is what the implications are. Know your audience. This is not a seminar. Let's say a workshop where you have 45 minutes to present your analysis to economists who are only concerned about methods. This is fundamentally a 10-minute seminar to a broader audience, and you need to say, this is what I find that is new, and this is the solutions that I'm proposing to this sort of problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, the next on is Vasilis Tselios, who is a professor of economics. Well, I don't know, it's no, Professor of Regional Analysis and Policy at Pantheon University in Greece. And you're going to be talking about climate-related regions, vulnerability, and European citizens' well-being associated with climate change. A long title.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Andres. I'm very happy as I'm here because I did my PhD at this university. Well, yeah, this is the title of my paper. And what I'm trying to do. Actually, we know that everybody knows that well-being is a broad concept and it is affected by many social, economic, political, and environmental factors. One of these factors is climate change, and climate change is also a contributor to natural disasters. And as we feel that in the future, we are going to have more areas that will be affected by climate change and natural disaster, this factor is likely to affect the well-being of citizens. The focus of this paper is not on the broad concept of well-being, but on the well-being associated with climate change. And we have here two variables. One is the worry about climate change, and worry, I think, is a feeling that affects well-being. And the other one is the feeling of personal responsibility to try to reduce climate change. However, we know that economies, regions, societies will be more affected by extreme natural disasters. And so regional policy and regional governments have to do something about that. So we want to investigate the determinants of well-being associated with climate change, but not on all the determinants. And the focus of this paper is on the climate-related regions' vulnerability. And we measure regional vulnerability in terms of climate impacts and in terms of climate policy. So what we're trying to do here, what the research question of this presentation is, does regional vulnerability to climate change and to the green transition affect European citizens' well-being in the context of climate change? We argue, or we expect that, of course, regional vulnerability affects well-being associated with climate change, but it depends on the level of environmental value. How people, European citizens, understand the importance of nature and environment. Why is that? Because environmental values shape how people perceive, recognize, and interact with the nature and the environment. So overall, what we want to see how climate effects at regional level and climate policy at regional level, how these variables affect the well-being of European citizens associated with climate change. In order to do that, of course, I do quantitative analysis and econometric analysis, but before that, I have to say something about the data that I use. Here I use the European Social Survey, is the most recent data, and the round 11, which refers to the period 2023 till 2024. It's very important to mention when I downloaded this database, because if I don't download this database now, so I may have more observations. I download this database on December in 2025, and it refers to 30 countries and European countries plus Israel. And for each country, we have data at the regional level, either at notch 1 or 2 or 3. And based on this survey, we are able to measure well-being and the worry of people about climate change. And here I make an assumption, but I'm not very sure about that, because this is likely to be the one side of the coin. This is why I have this emoji, that the higher the worry, the lower the well-being, because basically climate change worry affects emotional distress. But some people may say, okay, it's good people to worry about climate change because they're more aware of that and so on. Right, so this is the one proxy that I use for the well-being. The other one is the responsibility, the personal responsibility. And the question is, to what extent do you feel a personal responsibility to try to reduce climate change? And here also, maybe this is also the one side of the coin, is that the higher the sense of responsibility, the lower the well-being, because personal responsibility can lead to distress and guilt. And so both variables are climate-related concern variables. The other one key variable that I use for this paper is the environmental value from this survey. Why is that? Because this is a moderator factor, and people can say if they think the importance about the nature and the environment. And so the higher the importance, the higher the well-being, because exposure to nature is linked to better mood. So this is the key variables at the individual level that I use. And then we need some regional data. I will use the regional database. This I think was easy. I'm very lucky with that, that I have this database. Is that the database based on the working paper by Rodriguez Pose, Santos, Conte, and Mollica. And it provides data for 26 European countries and at NUTS 2 level. And here we are able to measure the climate. No, these guys have already measured the climate effects and the climate policy, which is a composite index. This is exactly what the paper says. Climate effects is the vulnerability to climate change effect index, which assesses how susceptible European regions are to direct climate-related impacts, integrating social, economic, and environmental perspective. And this about the climate policy, how regions might be adversely affected by policies designed to mitigate climate change, notably by the shift towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions and fostering sustainable economies. If we merge this database, we have the database is at NUTS 2 level, except for Germany and Italy, which are at NUTS 1 level, because we don't have this data based on the European Social Survey for at NUTS 2 level. And I have also changed the data which are provided at NUTS 3 level from the European Social Survey, from NUTS 3 to NUTS 2. Of course, there are some data that we have from the one database, but we don't have from the other database. And in total, we have data for 23 countries and for about 37,000 observations. Yeah. So this is the econometric specification. I use that with and without a moderation effect. I mean, the first question has to do if the direct impact of climate effect and climate policy on well-being, and the other one is if environmental value affects this impact. I use many controls at the individual level. This is a key variable, the causes of climate change, where people have answered if it is by natural process, human activity, or both, and many other. And of course, I have used many at the regional level. These are some very draft regression results. I highlight the most important statistically significant results, but I will skip this. And what we can see from the very preliminary analysis is that the higher the environmental value of European citizens, the higher their worry about climate change and their feeling of personal responsibility to try to reduce climate change. Okay. And for climate effects, which means that the higher the climate effects, the higher the responsibility, but we can say that this is likely to be the lower the well-being. And for climate policy, the higher the climate policy, the lower the worry and responsibility of citizens with, basically for citizens with high environmental values. What we can say, very briefly last sentence, is that in areas, in regions, European citizens who live in regions with very high climate effects worry and feel responsible about that. However, in regions where we have very good policies, climate policies, people worry less. For me, it is likely to mean that these policies work. But of course, this is a very general result, and I have to work more about this. Thank you very much.
Okay, questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, very great presentation. Thank you so much. So I have a question regarding for the multiple dimension of the well-being. So in your case, I have no idea about the data set you use, but I was wondering, are there any possibility to measure for not only just for the negative well-being, but also consider for the positive well-being? Is it possible to measure for that part?
No, but I control for the broad concept of well-being, not exactly for poverty or other indicators. Or I can use some regional controls like GDP per capita,
Okay.
which is likely to show if someone who lives in a region with very low economic development is likely to affect his well-being related to climate change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that.
Or I can use also at individual level the high income, but I don't have many observations on that. I have already used that in the regulations, but I have many missing observations.
Yeah. Because I really saw lots of see lots of the meta-analysis of the well-being papers. They mention about the multiple dimension of well-being. So yeah, if you can bring in any perspective of the well-being, I think maybe you can contribute to the theory a bit. That's just my own opinion. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No, so two things here. I mean, that's your tables are too long, but you didn't dwell on the table, so you went directly and you have a clear research question. Or the research question is far too long. So it's yours. To what extent does fear of reality of climate change and the policies that are implemented to fight climate change actually affect the anxiety and thus the well-being? But where I struggle with what you're doing is, what is the relationship between well-being and responsibility? What do you mean by responsibility that comes out very often, and how does it link to well-being, and how does it link to climate change, or let's say the green transition?
Yeah, I understand. This is why my emoji also there is not sure. Is that if you are responsible for something, sometimes you don't want to be responsible for things. So in terms of that, is that it doesn't contribute to have better well-being. Okay. But maybe this has to do also if people believe in climate change or not. What I mean, because I didn't mention that, because I want to tell a lot about that. The first question of the database, of the European Social Survey was about the causes of climate change. And people had the choices of to answer mainly by natural causes, or entirely by natural causes, mainly by the human activities, or mainly by human activities, or equally. Or there are also the options that people who say that I do not believe that climate change is happening. And the rest answers about war and responsibility refers only to those who haven't responded to that climate change is not happening. So in terms of that.
Yeah, but that's my problem there is, how does that relate to responsibility? Because you can say the impact is going to be different. You're dealing with individuals on climate change believers or climate change deniers.
Yeah.
So if you are a climate change denier, you're not going to be fearful of climate change.
Yes.
And that's whether you can perhaps take a look and see whether the differences is. One thing that you have to emphasize is that you're dealing with individuals. And of course, for those many of the people here will not be familiar, and that when you're dealing with well-being, normally the well-being literature focuses on individual characteristics. The novelty that you have put, and I've done in the past and other people, is that you bring territorial dynamics. And here the big novelty is that you're bringing climate change and policies towards climate change. So my advice would be, yes, put the controls that are individual, put the controls that are territorial, but then just highlight this go along with expectations and with what the theory has said before, and then focus mainly on your climate damage.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next on is Cristiane Aguirre, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago. You're going to be talking about failed constitutions, the lost history of constitutions that never got adopted. So the floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes.
It's yours.
Okay, it is set.
Yeah, it's set.
Let me try. Bring it. Okay, so hello everyone. Today I'll be talking about a project I've been developing with Professor Adam Chilton at the University. There's very much a work in progress yet, so any feedback would be very welcome. And we only have a few minutes, so I'll try to go to the essentials right now. So from data Professor Chilton, Stig, and myself have gathered, we have noticed that roughly 1 of every 10 constitutions that has been drafted since the end of the 18th century till now was never adopted as law. There's 10%, there's not a small number. Yet, when we look at the literature on comparative constitutional law, it overwhelmingly focuses on successful constitution-making processes and constitutions that became a law. Only in a few cases, if ever, do they focus on failed constitution-making and constitutional drafts that never made it into law. But even then, it's in isolation, it's case studies. You will, for instance, find literature on the Icelandic failed constitution-making process from the beginning of the 2010s. You will find a lot of recent literature on the recent failures in Chile, but they study them as case studies. There has been no systematic study to try to understand failed constitution-making as a general phenomenon. We argue that this generates a problem of survivorship bias. A lot of this literature, which again, overwhelmingly focuses on successes and not on failures, gives prescriptions, recommendations on how a constitution-making process should be designed, on what a constitution should contain. Yet they are only focusing on successful cases, on constitutions that actually made it into law. They are not looking at this 10% of drafted constitutions that never got adopted, at this 10% of failed constitution-making process. So with this project, and it's definitely a broader research agenda, we're trying to start covering this gap. So how do we start? We went through the constitutional history of hundreds of polities that have existed since the end of the 18th century till now. And we try to look for processes in which 3 criteria were met. A public organ officially initiated an official constitution-making process. That process produced a replacement draft or a new draft in a new country, and the draft did not make it into law. This to put some limits which allow us, for example, not to cover drafts that were written through an official path, like it could be a draft written by a civil society organization, or a constitution-making process that produced, that existed but never produced a draft, or a constitution that was enacted and became a law, but only lasted, let's say, for a few months or a few years. This limits allow us to limit those cases and keep them outside of this study. And what we found was 116 failed episodes, which have happened in 84 polities between 1787, which was the first one we found in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, and 2023 in Chile. I was going to add a map here so you could see sort of like the distribution. I forgot it. Now I have it here. And you can watch it. So what has the data told us thus far? Because again, there's very much work in progress. First, it would seem that constitution making has become more of a tricky business in the last few decades, and it has become much more fragile. What we did here is that we merged our 116 cases that I told you about before. We merged them with the data set of the Comparative Constitutions Project, which includes every constitution that was actually enacted and actually became law. And we asked ourselves, okay, of every constitution-making process that has happened in every decade, what percentage of them failed? And we produced a failure rate per decade. What we found is that particularly in the 20th century, failure was mostly marginal. Between the 1920s and the 1980s, the failure rate was never more than 10%. And even when we look at the 19th century, we see it goes up and down. But when we grab the whole amount of processes that happened in the 19th century, and we look at how many of them failed, it is still mostly marginal, except for a few decades of exception, for example, the 1840s, which is mostly explained by the liberal revolutions happening in Europe at the time. However, there's an interesting peak that starts happening from the 1990s and particularly from the 2000s. In the 1990s, the failure rate goes up over 10% for the first time since the 1910s. In the 2000s, it goes over 25%. In the 2010s, it goes over 30%. And in the 2020, thus far, it's already over 40%. So it would seem that at this moment in time, constitution making is more fragile than ever, is more risky than ever to try to do a constitution making process and get the constitution adopted. So there's the first thing we found. Second, the way in which this process has failed has changed over time. Historically, the most common way in which a process would fail would be through executive rejection, which is here 53, 41%. There's not mostly 19th century, early 20th century, there's 20th century is 990 onwards. And the way in which they would normally fail would be through executive rejection, where the prototypical scenario would be basically, there would be a strong executive who would at some point, for some reason, agree that there should be a new constitution. A drafting commissioner assembly would be appointed. They would draft the constitution, they would send it to the executive, and the executive, being powerful, could unilaterally veto that draft and put an end to the process. Take, for example, the case of Austria-Hungary in 1848-49. In the midst of the liberal revolutions that were happening in Europe at the time, Emperor Francis I accepted to draft a new constitution. And a parliament was named to draft this, and appointed to draft this, and they went to the town of Kremsier to do this. While they were doing the drafting, the momentum in the revolution changed. And the power of the reform power that had started the revolution started waning during that year. Moreover, a very young Franz Joseph replaced his uncle as emperor. By the time the Kremsier parliament came back with a draft and gave it to the emperor, he read the context appropriately, being the emperor, didn't like the draft, dissolved the assembly, and put an end to the process. That is the prototypical case. There are variations, there are even modern contemporary variations, but that's a prototypical case. However, as time has gone by, and particularly more in the contemporary period, failure by executive rejection has gone considerably down. And what we see more now is failures linked to the legislature and to citizens. The legislature rejecting a draft, citizens rejecting a draft through a referendum, or many cases as well in which it is scheduled that the legislature will have to take a vote, there will have to be a referendum, but in the end that never happens, and the process sort of quietly and slowly dies down. This is the second thing we have found thus far. Now, what could be producing this change from executive rejection to more legislative and citizen rejection? Of course, there are many causes, but we definitely argue that one of the causes is democratization. It is much harder to find in the world today extremely strong executives as you would find in a strong monarchy or a strong dictator in the mid-19th century that could unilaterally put an end to a constitution-making process and not permit the drafting, the enactment of a draft. And as well, processes have become more participatory and inclusive in recent years. To prove this, we use three variables on participation and inclusion constructed by Negreto and Sanchez Talanquer in their work and applied it to our constitution-making processes. As you can see here, as time has gone by, there have been a bigger percentage of failed constitution-making processes. There's only within our failed data in which for the draft to be approved, it would have needed the approval of different political parties and different coalitions with differing views, not just by one political party and one coalition. Also, as time has gone by, particularly since the 1990s, and here the growth is huge, a bigger percentage of failed processes included some form of citizen consultation, which could be, for example, when citizens get asked to send submissions with their proposals to the assembly. And as time has gone by, more failed constitution-making processes have included referendums at some stage in the process. Now, here there's an interesting correlation between the period in which processes seem to be becoming more participatory and inclusive and the period where constitution making seems to be becoming more fragile. And I want to highlight 3 times the word correlation here, because that's all we can talk about right now. We can't really say or argue at this point in our research that more participatory and inclusive processes are more likely to generate failure in a process than less participatory and inclusive. For that, we would need a control group composed of successful constitution-making processes in which we also take into account these variables. We are now building that control group, but that takes a lot of historical, archival, and source work. It takes time, unfortunately, so to be continued. However, what we can do right now is start thinking of mechanisms through which more participation and inclusion, while desirable for other reasons, could plausibly be connected to a higher risk of failure. And luckily, we have 116 cases in our data set, which are well sourced right now. So 116 case studies to study from. So very briefly, I will show you 2 mechanisms that we think are reinforcing and could connect participation to inclusion with an inclusion to a higher risk of failure in constitution making at a hypothetical level now based on case studies. First, inclusion and participation by definition bring more actors in. They bring more political parties, more civil society organizations. They bring individual citizens. This, for starters, will likely make agreement harder and it will take longer. But also, from a structural point of view, modern constitution making is more complex because you're bringing all of these actors in at different stages. You need different adoption stages. So again, at a prototypical, kind of stereotypical level, what a 19th century constitution making process would look like, it would be a drafting body and the executive. And adoption and no adoption would depend a lot on how those 2 groups and the elite of the drafting body and the executive, where they agree or not. Now, compare it with, for example, Chile's 2023 process. First, there was an expert commission. They went through the first draft, agreed it, and then they passed it to an elected convention. Then the convention made changes, had to agree on what changes to make. They built a second version of the draft, and it still passed, and then it went to referendum. And in the referendum, it was rejected by the citizens. The draft went through 2 adoption stages successfully. It didn't pass the 3rd one. And here you need to have approval in all 3 stages for it to become adopted. So one issue would be sequential veto points. The second mechanism we identified, which is connected, as you bring more actors, you bring more political parties, civil society organizations, citizens, and you need to have, as we talked about, structurally, a more complex structure. This will likely take more time. We actually measured this. We measured how long our failed process took by days and compared how participative and inclusive they were and whether there was any variation in days. Processes that had plural approval, a referendum and citizen consultation normally lasted longer, and in citizen consultation considerably longer in days, the processes that were not participatory inclusive in this way. And the problem with long processes is that context matters, as we explained with the example of Austria-Hungary and Franz Josef. And context can change. There can be a lot of power and will for reformation at the beginning, and in a few years that can disappear. Moreover, in time, there can be elections, there can be leadership changes, there can be coalitions realigning. And this, for example, happened in Zambia in 2013. President Michael Sata decided there was going to be a process and pushed for a new constitution in the country. The process started being delayed for several reasons, and after 2 years, President Sata died. And he was pushing for this process, and after him, the process pretty much silently and slowly died away. So, what can we claim and what we cannot claim right now? What we're seeing with the data is that it seems that constitution making has become more fragile recently. The way in which processes fail has fundamentally changed. In that same period in which processes have become more fragile, they've also become more participatory and inclusive. However, we cannot claim that more participatory and inclusive processes are more likely to produce failure than less participatory and inclusive processes. We need a control group for that on which we're working. However, we can start hypothesizing about the mechanisms that could vinculate participation and inclusion with failure, at least at this stage, and we're still finding the sources and the information for this control group. There's other information here that I originally planned to talk about. There's not going to be time, so I'll leave it up to here.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
I have a question. When you talk about constitution making process, is it drafting a constitution from scratch, or you also take a look at amending current constitutions? Because I'm taking a look at the map that is over there,
Yeah.
and I see Italy, right,
Yeah.
which is highlighted like
Yeah.
in you know, like in really blue.
Yeah.
And that's because Italy, as you obviously know, is the paradigmatic example of trying to amend the constitution and always failing to do so, right?
Yes.
So my question was that one. Is it drafting from scratch or also amending current constitutions in power?
I appreciate the question because we're only looking at replacements.
Okay.
The thing is, I only put it here. I should be clear because I've had actually that question asked before. We're not looking at amendments that, like, if you go into failed amendments through the history of so many polities, I think would be very difficult to get. We're only going for replacements. Good eye. Germany and Italy appear many times. It's because of 19th century states before the unification of both.
Okay.
So Grand Duchy of Tuscany, Modena, Parma, and they have also the German ones. It's a bit tricky, but it was impossible for me to try to build, and it didn't make sense. I would have some modern nations with some old ones. I thought about it a lot. So yeah, I put by contemporary state because of that, but it's a bit tricky.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? Yeah, I was going to go to the map is misleading. What you need to do is the percentage of constitutions that in a particular place failed. My question is, you said at the beginning, why do people don't study constitutions that fail? So you have to make a question about why. You have to make a stronger case. I think you made it at the beginning, but you need to highlight it a bit more. And there are two possibilities here. The one that you're going about, which, to be honest, I don't think it's interesting that you go so much into history. But the problem is that you're comparing pears with apples. So what you put a lot of emphasis that this is about sometimes legislative rejection, but the percentage remains the same. What changes is that you have now more consultation or rejection before it goes to consultation, and you have less executive rejection. And that is a big change, but also you also explained this is related to democracy. So my advice would be, if you're going down that route, the action is happening in the last 50 years, 60 years. So you have, as you said, in a period in which constitutions are more or less a democratic endeavor, and you have democracies much more expanded, the shift has been since the year 1990, 2000. So why did they not fail in the 1980s or 1970s, and they start to fail right now? And what is different? I think that would be where the action, because that's, you're comparing, if not pairs with pairs, different types of pairs with other pairs, not pairs with something that happened in Duchess of Tuscany, which, or if we put the example of Franz Joseph, so the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in which the king was an absolute king and could dismiss anything. So that's, I think that would be, the second thing that you haven't explored is, which might be interesting for a different project, not for this one, is what are the implications of a failed constitution? I agree. I suppose with your name, you're Chilean?
Yes.
Okay, so you're
Either Basque Country or Chilean. That would be.
no, but Christian is Chilean. So Itaguirre is the Basque Country. If you were from the Basque Country, you'll have a Basque name.
That is.
So, but you probably very much affected by the failure of the last constitutional process. What are the implications of that?
Yeah.
So because you have a massive process of consultation in many of these constitutions, and then you have others in which you might have less consultation. So what are the implications? Is it a completely wasted exercise, or is it something that at a certain point has got implications that might be beneficial or detrimental for society? Does it leave a society that is much more open to dialogue, or does it leave a society that is far more, let's say, polarized as a result of that? I'm not saying that you do anything here. My advice here is, it's good that you have all the history, and it's a lot of work, but focus on what's happening in the last 50 years. Because I think that's where. And but the other one would be another project that I think is as important, if not more important. Why should we study failed constitutions? Is because they leave a legacy, and they leave a legacy in society. Okay, you want to say something?
For the first point you made, would it make sense then, because that's what we're doing now, mostly because of source availability, for the control group with inclusion participation, use more motor cases, like the last 40, 50 years. It was mostly because of source availability, but it may fit with your.
What you have is that in the last 50 years,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not an expert on the laws, in the last 50 years, is not a question of authoritarianism versus democratic. It's a question that there's, at a certain point, something clicks, which is around
Yes.
1990, 2000s. And then the process is population becomes far less likely to accept a constitution.
Yeah.
I have my theories. It's because politics have become far more polarized. We have seen the growth of these streams. We have seen that although we're in a democracy, what we have is much greater polarization with societies. So there would be already from the beginning 50% of the population that is against any sort of constitution,
Yeah.
and there's much less capacity to reach consensus. But I mean, that's speculation. In the end, is something that would make it very interesting, because it's not that you have changed, it's a question of democracy versus non-democracy. Within democracy, what has happened that makes the constitutions less likely to succeed? Okay, thank you very much. So next one up is Alejandro de Rosa Cañete, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Valencia, and who's all going to talk about the expanding protection of judicial freedom of expression in the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. So you have 10 minutes and then start, more or less.
Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. The purpose of my presentation is to kind of study how the case law of the European Convention of Human Rights has developed during the last 25 years. My PhD is about how judges exercise their fundamental rights and fundamental principles as well, and how that may or may not affect the principle of independence and impartiality, right? So here we'll take a look at judicial freedom of expression. So, debate. We have on the one hand, that judges, they are citizens and obviously right holders, especially we have Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which protects the right of freedom of expression. But then on the other hand, we have the judges, they have a really important constitutional role because they have to be independent and impartial, and they have to be presumed by the public to be independent and impartial at the same time, right? So how do we combine both things? So before taking a look at the case law, I will try to explain a little bit what are the main instruments, the main norms that kind of govern these situations. So on the first hand, we have the European Convention of Human Rights. We have two articles at stake, Article 10, which is obviously freedom of expression, as said, and then Article 6, which is the right to a fair trial, fair, impartial, and independent trial, right? Then we have the basic principles of the independence of the judiciary, which was drafted by the UN in 1985, which highlights that judicial independence is a cornerstone of democracy, and they also have to protect the rule of law, right? After that, we had the Bangalore Principles of Judicial Conduct in the early 2000s, which highlight the same idea. Judicial independence has to be at the key of the protection of the rule of law in every state. And then coming back to Europe, we have the European Charter of the Statute of Judges, which this norm talks about judges as being right holders and having the right to publicly express, but with self-restraint, not coming to prejudge some cases that they may come before them. And we have different opinions from the Council of Judges of Europe, which are very interesting because they have to deal with these cases, right? Before going into the European Convention of the European Court of Human Rights. So right now, we are going to take a look at four major landmark cases. The first one would be Villa v. Liechtenstein in 1999, which was the first ruling that kind of addressed the issue of judicial independence, the rights of them to have freedom of expression. So I will give you a spoiler here. Judges, they can freely express themselves when it comes to constitutional debates, when it comes to legal reforms. So yes, they do have freedom of expression under these certain conditions. Then we have Kudishkina v. Russia in 2009, which says that judges have to be protected while exercising the freedom of expression if they are fighting against some attacks by other powers or by the public or by the media, because they have to protect their roles as safeguards of the rule of law in every state. We have Baka v. Hungary, which in my opinion is the most important one. We will take a look deeper later at what was happening in Hungary in 2016. And the last one, which is quite recent, is Danilet v. Romania, just last year, which expanded this protection of the European Court of Human Rights of judicial expression by judges, also to the use of social media, right? Because as you see, now we have a lot of debates about what happens with social media, judges, new forms of communicating, and how that may or may not affect the principle of independence and impartiality. So, taking a look at Vila v. Liechtenstein, this was the first case. It was a very interesting case because the president of the Administrative Court of Liechtenstein gave a public lecture. And in that public lecture, he openly criticized the Prince of Liechtenstein and the role that he had in appointing or dismissing certain judges, right? What was the consequences? That the prince, he got a little bit mad, and he decided not to reappoint the president of the Administrative Court of Liechtenstein. Then he went to the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Court found out that there was a violation of Article 10, because he was expressing his opinion in an academic lecture about the role that the prince had in the development of the constitutional state. So that was the first time that the European Court said that judges do not have to surrender their freedom of expression upon entering judicial office. We later go to Kudeshkina v. Russia in 2009. So here we have another example. We have Judge Kudeshkina, who went to talk to the media, to some newspapers, and she said that she had been pressured by the public prosecutor office in order to have some rulings in favor of some people. So he went to the media to publicly talk about that. And what was the consequences? That the Council of Judges of Russia gave him some heads up. She was suffered some disciplinary punishments, and then she went to the European Court of Human Rights. What did the European Court say? That her freedom of expression had been violated because what she was doing is protecting judicial independence from attacks by other power, in this case, the prosecutor, which it is linked to the executive power in Russia. And the disciplinary measures that were taken against her, they were revoked, and she was also put back into her place. Why? Because in order to protect the judicial independence, we also have to protect judges when exercising their freedom of expression with regards to the rule of law and the protection of their roles in a democratic state. Then we have Baka v. Hungary, 2016. I'm sure that you have heard about this. The Hungarian government was trying to pass some constitutional amendments that would have, well, actually they did, the retirement age was down. So a lot of judges were pushed to retirement. And the president of the Hungarian Supreme Court went to the media, he gave public lectures, he sent letters to members of parliament criticizing that reform. That reform, it was later passed. What was the consequence of that reform being passed? That he lost his position as president of the Hungarian Supreme Court because he had to retire due to these changes with retirement age of judges. So he went to the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights found out that his freedom of expression had been violated because he was being punished for publicly expressing his thoughts about the
undermine actions against the rule of law and the democratic state that the government of Hungary was putting into place. And the last one, Danilet v. Romania, last year, 2025. It is also interesting because it is not related or not that much related to the defense of the rule of law or judicial independence. It is more a judge publishing and kind of commenting certain things in Facebook posts. So it is true that it was some comments on constitutional and public interest issues, but not really directed to the rule of law, which is also interesting in this case, right? Because the European Court of Human Rights at the beginning said that yes, freedom of expression had to be protected when it came to safeguarding the rule of law, democracy, and judicial independence. But this ruling has kind of expanded this protection of freedom of expression, right? So this judge, he faced also disciplinary sanctions. He later went to the European Court of Human Rights. We had the ruling last year, and it was found out that he had been punished for publicly talking out loud and expressing his opinions, right? This was the first case that dealt with expressing opinions on social media, because the previous ones were about talking public lectures, talking to the media, issuing public statements or letters to members of parliament, kind of pressuring them. But this one was 2 posts on Facebook. What was the key contribution of this case? That judges, they retained the freedom of expression even in social media. So, as you can see, and with this I will finish up, we are seeing that in the last 25 years, we have seen a growing protection on judicial freedom of expression. At the beginning, as I said, it was kind of linked to the protection of judicial independence, the protection of the rule of law, and the paper that judges play as cornerstone and protectors of the democracy. But since then, it has expanded through different landmark cases. And now it is true that the European Court of Human Rights kind of increases this view of judicial freedom of expression as a component of the protection of judicial independence and the rule of law in a broader sense. Now we have social media, before it was public lectures, both of them are protected, as well as not comments just related to the defense of the rule of law, but also to some other public interest related comments. So that will be. Thank you.
Questions? Let's go ahead.
Yeah, Christian, thank you very much for the very nice presentation. I'm not very familiar with this kind of research, and I can see that you have many very interesting findings. My question is, what is the main hypothesis of this research, where someone who is not very familiar with this kind of research like me, I can, link all these different findings?
Okay, thanks for the question. So, you know that Sonia Sotomayor, she is a Supreme Court justice from the Supreme Court of the United States. And she says that the 21st century is the century of the judges. Because judges, as she said, they are protectors of the rule of law, right? So I think that right now we are kind of facing really stressful time for judges, because they are usually being attacked by governments all around the world in different countries, not just in the US, also in Spain, also in South American countries, everywhere. One of the main questions that is kind of arising is if judges should, for instance, express their opinions, but not only that, but also like publicly go to strikes, right? Or do manifestations or different exercises of their fundamental rights. So this is obviously just a tiny part of the research that I'm doing under my PhD, but that would be the question, right? What is the intersection of judges as being private citizens and obviously right holders, and if that affects or can affect them as their public figures and being constitutional safeguards, right? So I don't know if I answered.
Thanks.
Yeah, question.
I just had a question. You may have this information or not, but if not, it could also be like a good idea for future research. Do you know if this trend, right, that you see, is also being followed like within each jurisdiction within Europe, or there are like cuts, like what if they have any trends, any clear trends, if any, in some of these countries, and whether they're following this trend or not? So, for example, looking at the court, the constitutional court in Spain, or the Conseil Constitutional in France, or the federal constitutional court in Germany, or whatever, if they are following the trend or not. Maybe don't know now, but that could be interesting, like within the sub-jurisdictions, let's say, of the EU.
So thanks for the question. It's true that I have to develop a little bit more on that. But with regards to Spain, the Council of Judges, they have an ethics committee, and that ethics committee follows word by word the European case law, the European case law from the European Court of Human Rights. So at least from Spain, they have, and I believe that in the UK, it is also kind of happening, because I found out a paper a few weeks ago, which was dealing with a judge having LinkedIn connections with some parts, blah, blah, blah. And they were referring also to the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, as they are part of the European Convention of Human Rights. Thank you.
Okay, so we have to move on, but just one thing. I feel a bit like Vasilis, and I'm not from this field, of course, but it's like 4 cases in search of a topic. We have 4 cases on the protection of the freedom of speech of judges, but then you try to bring them together towards the end. You need to bring them together at the beginning. So what is the question that you're raising? Because everything points that the European Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights, is protecting the freedom of expression of judges and is making it stronger. But what you're saying, and what is my impression with coming from outside, is that judges, as part of this judicial protection, are far more coerced now in many of the countries that you're dealing with, Russia, Hungary, of course, Liechtenstein, which is an absolute monarchy still, than they were in the past. So you need to try to, how do you put all this together? The fact that there's an increase in protection according to judicial decisions, but in reality, there seems to be that their freedom of speech is being far more coerced from, let's say, the legislative powers in the countries they are. And so my advice would be, try to see how you put all this together and link it to reality and make it from the beginning something that is not just an enumeration of different cases saying, yeah, this is interesting, each case, but how does that change society? And then just one question about the BACA. Why did the court actually, because in all the other cases I point, yes, they're right, but BACA, the Hungarian government actually reacted in the right way. We don't like you, but we're not going to say we don't like you. We're just going to say you're too old, and we change the
You have to retire.
So you have to retire because you are beyond the age.
He was not, so with regards to that case, he was obviously ruled in favor, but he couldn't be put back in his position because of that legislation.
All right. So fine.
So
good. Yeah. Thank you very much. The next one is Marco Maria, I suppose. It's a PhD candidate at the Politecnico di Milano, Bocconi University, talking about who governs, the institutional role of firms in local development and the future of industrial policy. Field notes from the UK and Spain. Thank you.
So good evening. I have 30 slides, but I'm going to focus on 10. So respecting the time, and trying also to leave some space for the question, because I'm sharing a lot of the struggles that I've been having during the field work. So my presentation today is about the preliminary findings of what the fieldwork I've been conducting between UK and Spain this month, bring to my doctoral project. I titled this conversation, the talk, Who Governs, borrowing the question from the political scientist Robert Dahl, which is one of the like theoretical pillars of my framework, but also because of what would be too harsh of myself. But yeah, I leave that also to your questions. I'm glad, to be honest, that the field work that I've been doing complicated in some ways my understanding of how firms exercise their institutional power, even when, as you see, they would prefer to decline a political role. So I have spent, as I was saying, the term in the field, so not many days here in the school, and I went in Castellón, in Galicia, in the southwest of England. I will not talk right now through the cases, but I'm trying to share the analytical work, so the conceptual argument, the field work forced me to, and then to keep the cases for discussion, where you can press me also on the evidence directly. So my question, which is the broader question of my doctoral dissertation, sits inside a research program I'm so ambitious to call a corporate statecraft. By that, I don't mean lobbying, but a firm's capacity to participate in and shape the institutional order of the places where it operates. So this program began between Northern Italy, where I reside, and the United States, where I conducted many research periods, and in regions specifically where a local institutional vacuum drew private firms into a developmental role. It carries one distinction I will lean on throughout: open versus closed statecraft. Open statecraft, this is a preliminary assumption, builds resilient, independent local institutions. Closed statecraft binds a region's face to a single firm. This month, I took the frame to Britain and Spain, and as I was saying, the fieldwork complicated that a little. So 4 cases across Spain and Britain. Porcelanosa, a ceramic tile producer. Inditex, fast fashion conglomerate. Dyson, here in Britain, and the renewal of Manchester, which is the thinnest that I have, and I'm going to work more in the next month. These set against my baseline, which is the Italian-American districts, where firms, generally or not, but in the end, in my findings, became more evidently institution builders. So what's the complication? Both Britain and Spain turn out to be less politically embedded than I expected, and what I found in manufacturing regions in Italy and the United States. The very few that are still in the United States. But the way they do is in an opposite direction. In Britain, the firm exit without voice. After globalization, financialization, firms leave because they cannot find voice. That's my initial understanding. And that connects to Hirschman. In Spain, I found a different direction, as I was saying. The firm holds real economic power. It's deeply rooted, but it's precisely where the political nature stops. Both the chief executives that I interviewed, the Porcelanosa and the Inditex one, describe themselves as committed simply to doing their work well and not to build the institutions that would bind firms and region together. So I think that we need to go, of course, deeper than this statement. We have to read the instruments and not just the declaration. And this is another scholar point, I believe, Pepper, a professor at Oxford. which is that the real power is often had by staying low silence. He wrote a very interesting book called Quiet Politics. That is, again, another of the inspiring source of my work. Silvestre Segarra, the CEO of Porcelanosa and a member of the family, actually also stated to me a very clear sentence. A company is not what it proclaims, but what sustains over the years through its decision. So, if we read what a firm sustains, a town tax base, the firm count or a comarca, pardon my pronunciation in all languages, a training pipeline, that is where the politics actually lives. So reading them the way forces a distinction the cluster literature usually tend to merge. The first is territorial embeddedness. So the firm is rooted in a place through its employee, its tax base, its identity. The firm belongs to the town. The second is capability embeddedness, and that's my complication, where the industrial capability actually lives. The design, the material, the machinery, and that can sit a regional way or across the world. So this is the spine of my argument related to the field work. The two are usually assumed to travel together. The Marshallian intuition is that capability is local genesis. My claim is that they have come apart. Plot capability source against territorial rootedness, and a diagonal appears. Sassuolo in Italy is rooted and on ground. Sassuolo is the ceramic tile industrial cluster in Italy, on which I'm comparing Porcelanosa and Castellon. Porcelanosa is rooted in Villarreal, but its capability is imported from Italy. And yeah, in the cases, I have the evidence for that. Inditex is rooted in Galicia, but its capability is sourced from the entire globe. They actually call their proximity arc, the region, it goes from Galicia to Portugal, and then Morocco and Turkey. So that's proximity to that. Dyson is neither, sliding toward an exit, a firm that can be deeply rooted, and they tried, and also there's evidence to this, while its capability now lives elsewhere. The gap is a decoupling, and it's a measure of the exposure. So this is the conclusion of my preliminary findings. Why does this matter politically? Because the strategy is business, but the consequences is political. It belongs to the strategy, not the intention. Jobs and taxes stay local. In the short term, capability is sourced elsewhere. Over the long term, in the short term, the town rests healthy, we can see that, but in the long term, it cannot stand without the firm. So we have a dependency. In Spain, the firm declines the developmental role, the two that I'm looking up more closely, and they do legitimately. In Britain, it's the community that declines it, and they do equally legitimately. So no one claims it, no one performs it, and that empty space where capability is authored inside the firm without local participation is exactly where open statecraft would operate and does not. So yeah, I'm still looking for an answer to my initial question, who governs and who answers for it, as I'm transitioning also my doctoral studies in the field of law and corporate law. Accountability is going to be a big theme for me. And but also, when the champion will not be the capability a region needs to outlast, who does? And this is the question that lies really deep in my heart. So, and I can corroborate the things I said with more data, but I wanted to give you like the analytical move I think I obtained. So
thank you very much. Well, my first is who governs, but when you have a govern, is the question whether firms govern or not, and they're rooted, but you have the governed. So in order to know who governs, you have to, you're talking just to the firms, aren't you?
No, I'm so like in Manchester, I'm going to talk with political leaders. For Dyson, I got the chance to talk with a business director for 16 years, but before he was a politician of the local constituency of the same region.
That's a conflict of interest. So you need to talk people who are in the firm and people who are outside the firm.
Yeah.
Not necessarily just in government, but you need to talk to suppliers, you need to talk to civil society, you need to, because to see what is the rootedness of these firms. Second, your firms are very different. It's not the same. Inditex, which is by far the largest firm in Spain and is a massive colossus in the economy of Galicia, and especially is the firm that maintains the economy of the city, La Coruña, and afloat, to Porcelanosa, which is a part of a cluster and also a declining cluster, which is suffering and which is much smaller than what it once was. So, and when you're talking about Dyson, of course, in Malmesbury is a big player, but Dyson is no longer there, or hasn't been for quite some time. So those are the sort of things that you need to highlight, whether the cases that you're choosing are really comparable or not, and how do you justify the cases that you have chosen to make sure that they work. So not just talk to the firms, talk to the others to see whether the perceptions are aligned or do not align, and also then say, when you're doing an international comparison, how can you compare things that might be very different stages, not just different stages, different sectors, different technologies, different engagements with the local community, but also at the national level. Good.
I agree.
Good. Thank you. So, what time do we have the dinner?
8:30.
8:30. So we have to go quickly. Xiaoming Tao, Dr. Xiaoming Tao, Assistant Professor of Innovation and Project Management at the University of Sussex. So not far away from here in Brighton. Palmer. Determined to drive out geopolitical risks, government effectiveness, and opportunity entrepreneurship. Thank you so much. Are we getting to sticks and sushi?
Yes. All right, thank you so much for this great opportunity. So my topic will be more about how the geopolitical risk affects the opportunity entrepreneurship, and whether and how the government effectiveness affects such process. And my question, I just want to start my presentation with a very simple question. So nowadays, we all know that for the geopolitical risks, they are around the world. So when such things happens, so let's just imagine for the wars, for the conflicts, and for the terrorism, when all these things happens, so do entrepreneurs go forward, or maybe they just step back? So actually, this is also the question at the heart of our paper. So when we look at the geopolitical risk, as we mentioned earlier, definitely it has become define the feature of the nowadays the global, the economic environment. And when we look at its effect on the entrepreneurs, but nowadays actually we do not have enough evidence, and even for geopolitical risk has lots of the publications within the international business, the finance and the trade and investment. But when we look at its effects on entrepreneurs, so actually we do not have very much clear idea about that. And if we look into the existing literatures, so actually the existing, the literature offers us the two very different themes of the answers. So one, I will call it the subversive, the view, because we can find that actually the uncertainty can, make the entrepreneurs more cautious. So it will affect the supply chain and affect their financial conditions and make them to feel, the unpredictable of the policy environment. But on the other way, we also have some evidence about, I will call it the generative view. So generative view means such disruptions also create opportunities. So when we look at some publications within the entrepreneurship, so we can find for such disruptions, they can change the opportunity conditions and environments a lot. So in that way, it seems like such disruptions can also provide open up some new markets and also create some space, for the new ventures. And in that way, it seems a bit conflicting. So how can we understand seems like the opposing the effect of geopolitical risk on entrepreneurship? And this thing is also important for opportunity motivated entrepreneurship. The reason why? Because for such opportunity motivated entrepreneurs, they will be driven by the opportunity. So they are more opportunity sensitive. So in that way, if they feel they do really have some changes regarding or come from the geopolitical risks, so they will become more sensible for their next step. It's not about they do not have any other options. It's more about opportunity driven. So in that way, we also find some publications regarding for the governance, the quality. They also mention that, okay, a very good government quality maybe can help the entrepreneurs, can help the governments to deal with such, challenges from the geopolitical risk. But at the moment, and also unfortunately, we still have no clear idea what is the specific, the conditions and the ways actually the government can help us to deal with the geopolitical risk. And in that way, it comes to over two research questions. So the first research question is more about how does the geopolitical risk shape the opportunity motivated entrepreneurs across the different, the perspective, and how does the relationship shift from the suppressive to the generative? And the second one, how does the government effectiveness conditions the effect of the geopolitical risk on opportunity entrepreneurship? So to address these two research questions, we draw on the real options theory. So this theory is, it's quite simple, and the core idea is about for the entrepreneur entries, it's not only just about whether to enter to the market, and it's more about when, what is the best timing to enter into the entrepreneur, the market. And in that way, at the moment, we do really find two competing evidence at work. So the first one, we call it the option value of waiting. The reason why? Because if you can feel, the low to moderate level of the geopolitical risk, so the entrepreneurs maybe need a bit more time to get the essential information and to have the clear idea. It seems like at the moment, there is a value for waiting until things clean up. But if we look at the other side, that still have some cost of the opportunity decay. The reason why we call it the opportunity of decay, because we mentioned that for the opportunity motivated entrepreneurs, they are really sensitive to some potential opportunities. So if when we have the higher level of the geopolitical risks, if the entrepreneurs, they do not try to into the market, so maybe they will miss the opportunity, especially in the high level of the geopolitical risk. So in that way, it seems like the balance between the two, forces from the suppressive value of the geopolitical risk and until to the other side of the generative view of the geopolitical risk. So it's the balance between these two views shift from the different level of the geopolitical risks. So this is the thing. And we wanted to clarify that actually we wanted to argue there would be a U-shape between the geopolitical risk and the opportunity entrepreneurship, not because of maybe the uncertainty become less, but it's more about how does the dynamic, the logic change a bit when we have the increased the geopolitical risk. And this is our conceptual framework. And we can mention for the first research question, we just argue that GPR has a U-shaped relationship with OME. This is the opportunity motivated entrepreneurship. And on the other way, we further argument that for the government effectiveness actually can moderate such a U-shape. So from the low to the moderate, the level. So actually the higher government effectiveness can help the entrepreneurs to get a clear idea about the situation, what the situation is going on. So that can decrease the value of waiting. And from the moderate to the high level of the geopolitical risk. So actually the government effectiveness can perceive the infrastructure and can enhance the construct. And in that way, actually, the entrepreneurs can feel a bit less sensible to that way, because they think actually the high level of the government effectiveness can slow down the opportunity decay. So in that way, we argue that the government effectiveness moderate the GPR and OME relationship, and most importantly, it's not just moderate the levels, it's more about how to influence the share between the GPR and OME. And to test over two hypotheses, so we combine or incorporate the two main data sources from the global entrepreneurship, the MONET, and also from the GPR index, and also with the worldwide the governance indicators and other the public datasets. And in total, we have the 33 economies during the 2005 until the 2018. And we have 334 observations, and this is also the control level data analysis. And we employed the system, the GMM module, and we use the U-shape test from the Hans published in SMJ to test the potential, the U-shape relationship. We also control some, the macro level, economic, and also for the social cognitive, the factors of the country variables. And these are some description statistics and also the variable descriptions. And for the opportunity motivated entrepreneurship, this is from the global entrepreneurship MONET, the dataset. So it's more about the percentage of the individuals. Individuals, they go for the entrepreneurship because they really they are driven by the opportunity rather than they try to find any other options. So it's a percentage of the population across the world, across the country. And for the geopolitical risk, so this is a new GPR index. It's capture the information and the people's perception of the situation. And yeah, sorry about that. And if we look at for the hypothesis test, so I just put some figures over here for details if you like, but I just want to highlight the reason. So if we look at the final result, if we mention that we will rely on for the U test, so it's a more solid and robust way, so we can find the slope on the left. So from the low to moderate level, it seems like the shape is significantly negative. And if we look at the other side, the right side, from the moderate to the high level of the relationship, we can find it's significantly positive. And most importantly, for the turning point, it's between the GPR range. So we find the evidence to support the H1. And when we come to the H2, so it's more about the moderation of such a U-shape. We also find the evidence to support our idea. If we look at the interaction between the GPR squared and the government effectiveness, we also find such significant relationship. So I just put the figure over here, left the panel zooms into the lower to moderate GPR, we can find it's a slowdown shape. And if we look at the other side, it's also significant. We also conduct some robustness checks for 8 types, and finally we come to the theoretical contributions. So it's more about the U-shape of the relationship. Also some basic suggestion for the comment.
Wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you.
So, thank you. Is the noise coming from the?
I'm pretty sure because this has.
Yeah, some of the speakers. So, okay, so fine, questions? Yes, Christian?
One question regarding time coverage. You said you covered 43 economies in like a 13-year period, but you're covering different amounts of years per country, right?
Yeah,
Like you're not covering the whole 1343.
yeah, it's
Then it
about,
doesn't add up like 334.
yeah, it's a 33. I mean, I taught economics because they also have some different regions. So Taiwan and Hong Kong and any special, regions. So actually based on the data, they do not call it the countries or regions. So I just call it economics. Yeah.
And for some, like a longer period, some for others. Like for some, you only have data.
Yeah, actually, because there's 4 different types of the data set. For the GM, actually, they are long-term more than 100 countries across for 30 years. But for the GPR at the moment, they only have around 44 countries. So for 20 years, so we need to incorporate all the available data range.
Okay, so, yeah, few things here.
Yeah.
I still missing what is the killer message
Okay.
in your presentation, because you
Yeah.
cover a lot of things.
Yeah.
And you have a relatively clear research question, but
Yeah.
what is it that you contribute?
Yeah.
To existing knowledge?
Should I?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we call it actually the key thing is we contributed to the real optional series by providing the U-shape between the risk, the macro level uncertainty and the entrepreneurship. Yeah, so this is the key thing we wanted to convey. Yeah.
Okay, so, yeah, 2 things. Your slides still have a lot of words. So when you ask Claude to help you do the slides, tell Claude to do less words or just guide it more in that respect.
Yeah.
And then third, when delivering, you spend more about 50% of your time looking at the screen rather than look at the audience.
Yeah.
The percentage of you looking at the screen should be no more than 5%. So I always engage with the audience. You know the topic much better. There's no need. And the more words you put, the more likely you are to look at the screen. So you put some images, you put some results, and then you actually engage much more with that. Okay, thank you very much, Emily.
That's very helpful. Thank you, sir.
Ricardo, you're here.
Yeah, I'm here.
So it's Ricardo Martinez de Vega Perancho, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Oviedo, who's going to be talking about development traps and populist rhetorical contagion, evidence from Vox and the Partido Popular in Spanish regional parliaments. So the floor is yours. 10 minutes.
I'll try to be brief because of matters of time, but today I'm going to present a work that sits within the political economics strap of literature and the economic geography literature. The main research question is whether regional stagnant regions make mainstream parties more prone to adopt populist rhetoric. So in the last 30 years, we've seen a massive surge in populist parties' vote share. In 1995, we've seen a completely total absence of it. But in 2022, here we are computing both populist parties from the left side and the right side. To the point that in 2022, 26 out of the 27 countries in the European Union have at least one populist party in their Congress. Within this frame, in another work in progress work with my co-authors Balado Naves and Diada Pena, we found that this has a cost. Indeed, we found that a 1 percentage point increase in populist vote share reduces regional GDP per capita by 0.52% in the long run. But why talking about mainstream populist contagion, right? Because if they are not the ones carrying out that economic cost. So as I posted, mainstream economic, if mainstream parties adopts this populist rhetoric, then you have some kind of voter habituation to that rhetoric that lowers the psychological threshold for populist vote. Then it may have more populist support, more populist presence in the parliaments, and carrying this economic cost beyond that 0.52%. In the populist contagion literature, we have 2 basic strands the one that looks at programmatic contagion within manifestos just before elections, or rhetorical accommodation, in which we are going to be based on. And we have another separate literature, which is with links regional decline, with Andres' work as a central piece, linking left behind places and development traps to populism. We aim to link these two strands and ask whether if this populist contagion is geographically structured. This is if regions at risk of falling into a development trap make mainstream parties susceptible to populist rhetoric. To address this research question, first, what we are going to choose is the basic and main populist right party in Spain, which is Vox. And then we have more kind of a mainstream right party, which is Partido Popular, PP. So we're going to ask first if there exists some contagion on average. And then we are going to see if this contagion is higher in development trap regions. So why Spain matters? This is a very pretty clear and nice sub-regional laboratory in which we have the same populist challenger, we have the same mainstream party, right party, and 17 different arenas, which are the autonomical parliaments in Spain. We have a regionalized entry because Vox didn't entry at the same time in all parliaments, giving us this variation to do a within country staggered design. Since we have different regions, we can ask a different question from existing contagion studies. And finally, but not least, of course, we have different long-term trajectories within Spain. These can allow us to test whether this stagnation deepens and shapes the mainstream political discourse. So from development traps to populist traps. Here I pose basically the main ideas of Andres and co-authors, in which development trap regions or regions in risk that are at risk of falling into a development trap have a structural discontent in which their performance is relatively worse to the country and the whole European countries. They have youth migrations and discontent within the institutions, so they have a massive pool of voters willing to take revenge in the ballot box. So there's this higher payoff for mainstream parties to somewhat adopt this populist rhetoric and accommodate this populist discourse. So this gives us three hypotheses, which first is if there exists some aggregate contagion. So if after Vox enters a regional parliament, the PP increases its use of rhetoric. The second one is a populist trap. So if the PP Partido Popular response is stronger in that regions at risk of falling into a development trap. And finally, the dimensional hypothesis in which the amplification concentrates in some topics and not in others. How are we going to do this? We are going to do this basically analyzing political discourse with natural language processors. We take all these digitalized transcripts from the regional parliamentary plenary debates at the NUTS 2 level in Spain from 2015 to 2024. We separate all these paragraphs and then we label some of these paragraphs following a code book to see if this paragraph is anti-elite, people-centrist, or is host right. We use it to test it, and then we are going to train this model based on these labels to classify all these paragraphs and construct and build this populist pattern. I just don't want you to read all this, so I'm going to go to the first slide because I think my research question is pretty clear now, so I want to skip all these technical details and just thinking loud and say, okay, so if we have all these political populist contagion that may work on the right side and in the left side, then we may have a bigger polarization that drives us to less constitutional approvals, to more attack on judges, and to other some kind of problems. So in terms of political policy implications, I don't have the answer, but I just want to let the question for you and think, do we have some kind of democratic answer to stop this contagion? If it's true, and if it's going to polarize society and has this economic cost, do we have some kind of instruments? Because of course we are not going to legalize police parties, but how can we actually answer this problem? And that's basically all. Thank you very much.
One, two, three. You whet my appetite, but you didn't put any results.
Yeah.
But there are no results. Or...
Yeah, no, because I'm just labeling all these paragraphs, and I have some basic results of this paragraph analyzed,
Okay.
but they are just not reliable just for now.
Okay, my question then is, why limit yourself to Vox and the PP and not to Vox and any other party? Because what we're seeing here in the UK is that we had a party that was called UKIP, and then the Brexit party led by Nigel Farage that went to the elections in 2015, had a minimal share of the vote, no members of parliament, and the policies were derided. And then 4 years later, after Brexit, the policies on Brexit were adopted completely, even more radical by the Conservative Party. And then in 2024, 2025, the Labour Party adopted the policies that were proposed by UKIP on the basis of migration. So it might be that it's not just radicalizing one specific party, it's radicalizing a lot of other parties, like the Social Democrats, for example, in Denmark. And you might want to look as well. Vox is not governing, it's a small party, but still relatively large. But you also have the left-wing populists in Spain with other types of discourses. So my advice would be, if you can do this, and of course it's computationally intensive, but once you do it, you can do it for the whole spectrum of political parties, especially because in different regions in Spain, there would be different parties governing, and that would be important to see how, in the end, the discourse of the mainstream parties has shifted as a result of the rise of populism.
So basically, for just Spain, there's a data limitation in terms of these transcripts, because from 2013 or 2012, all these transcripts are digitalized. But before that, you just have like scanned PDFs, which are very difficult to compute because you have to use some other specific models within text recognition, which are more computable demanding.
Okay.
So that's basically, but that's pending work, of course.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Any? No? And you might want to update a bit the style of your slides, because it's still very much 20th century slides. So the same to Vladimir, but and bring a bit more. I mean, we have a lot of new tools here.
Yeah.
More images, and then also to highlight that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with plain white and black and white slides, but in the end, you tend not to put too many words.
Yeah.
And an image sometimes helps much more than words. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for coming. So we now continue with the more social side, which is we go and share a dinner, and then we exchange views on discussions, not just necessarily related to the research that we're all conducting. So thank you for coming. Thank you. Please follow us, not just you, but everyone here, but also those following online on our usual channels, which are LinkedIn and X, for next events. And remember, we've still got the next event together with, in this case, the European Institute, and within the framework of the LSE Festival. We have the president of the AIB, Nadia Galvino, talking here on the 16th of June, next week at 5 p.m. between 5 and 6. So stay tuned, follow us, and just wrap it up now. Thank you very much. Let's go. Get ready because we got 15 minutes to go.